I guess I was curious as to more whether it was the movies that gave you ideas or whether everything and anything you've done has kind of been your own thoughts. And
I can't think of any movies that I got. Well, there was a book I read years and years ago that gave me a lot of ideas, but I can't really blame that because I was already doing stuff when I read that book.
But it gave you ideas.
Yeah.
What book was that?
It's called Intensity by Dean Koontz. And that was the first book I had read that kind of talked about things from the other point of view. Like I read crime novels all the time, but it's always from the detective's point of view. It's never from the bad guy's point of view. And it always pissed me off that I could never find one from the bad guy's point of view. So I read that one. And, yeah.
But you said you used to read crime books. So did you get ideas from that?
No, nothing specific, I don't think.
Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. You requested it, and so here it is. This is how the book Intensity could have influenced Israel Keyes and his crimes. I hope you enjoy. Let's begin by covering some of the storyline of Intensity, and there are going to be some major spoilers in this next part, so be warned. The main protagonist of the book is named China Shepherd. She is studying psychology at the University of California, and a big part of the story revolves around her reliving memories of her traumatic childhood, filled with abuse and trauma. China's friend is named Laura, and both Laura and China decide to leave San Francisco, taking a 4-day break from their university classes. They're travelling to spend the weekend at Laura's parents' house in Napa Valley. The house is remote and surrounded by vineyards. On arrival, China meets Laura's parents and they have dinner. In the night, on the same day of their arrival, China is suddenly awoken to a muffled scream. She is concerned because she feels an unfamiliar presence in the house. A dark figure enters China's room but does not locate her. As she hides under the bed, she can see and hear blood dripping onto the floor. China had initially believed it to be Laura's brother, but the blood proves this not to be the case. Once the figure leaves, China plucks up the courage to investigate and uncovers a brutal scene. Both of Laura's parents have been murdered. China then finds Laura, who is clinging on to life, and Laura reveals that her brother and his partner have been murdered elsewhere on her parents' property. And the worst part is, the killer is nowhere in sight. China looks out a window and sees headlights from a vehicle in the distance and goes to seek help. It turns out to be the killer's motorhome, basically a torture chamber on wheels. China evades the killer again and is unaware that she's even present at the house. Laura can be heard screaming again before a dead silence. China wants to ambush the killer, but upon entering Laura's bedroom, she is no longer there. The killer has managed to carry her to his motorhome and leaves her there. China ends up trapped in the vehicle, finding Laura deceased inside. The killer then drives away from the house. All the while, China remains undetected, confined to the killer's home. The book bounces between China and the killer's perspectives, like Israel had mentioned. China manages to flee from the killer, who hasn't yet realised that she exists. China feels enraged about her friend and family having been murdered, plus her childhood trauma backstory is brought up, and this serves to fuel her anger toward him. She wants justice. The killer is trying to continue feeding his high following the night's murders, and now wants to make it back to a captive in his basement back in Oregon. Her goal then becomes to save the captive and bring the killer to some sort of justice, but for the while she has to stay off his radar. The killer is driving along desolate stretches of road and travelling along Highway 101. China is following him in a vehicle. China stages a fake car accident on the road just ahead of the killer, and at first he falls for it. The car has veered off the road and has crashed into some woodland. But the killer becomes confused and intrigued by the mystery of where the driver could have gone. He notices the female driver in the darkness and quickly realises that she's focused on him for some unknown reason. Stranded in the middle of nowhere, China ends up having to return to hide in his motorhome as she wants to save his captive. The killer is excited to see what she'll do, concealing his knowledge of her being back there in an attempt to continue the intensity of the evening. Since Israel brought up the book, it's unlikely that it contains any super relevant information regarding his crimes, but it does contain some of the main themes from his crimes, and it would have influenced his crimes to some capacity. The killer takes trips for 3 to 4 days in order to commit his crimes in different states. Using the highways, he drives for thousands of miles and takes any opportunity that presents itself to him, whether that be hitchhikers or people who have broken down on the side of the road. Following the murder of the family in Napa Valley, he immediately leaves the area and ends up committing additional murders as if he's still fueled by the adrenaline from the evening. Now we know that Israel kept a tight timeline, and there is speculation by the FBI that he engaged in criminal activity during a 3-day visit to San Francisco in 2010. He drove on the highways and would take a longer route if need be, and the killer in Intensity does the same exact thing. Israel was like most serial killers. He would take any opportunity that he could. If a situation didn't work out, he would look for another victim. Now, whether just a simple coincidence or influence from the book, Israel had travelled to Napa Valley on multiple occasions. Napa Valley is most known for its vineyards. It's a wine region. He rented a kayak in Healdsburg, which is just northwest of the Napa Valley, in May 2007. The FBI believes that there is a victim or victims in or around the Napa Valley. Israel travelled along Highway 101 on the same trip, and he had been elsewhere in Napa County, including Calistoga and Napa. Another theme which crops up a lot in the book is the theme of car wrecks. The killer is mentioned to be thinking about ramming vehicles off the road and bumping into them in an attempt to make the driver lose control. This would occur along empty stretches of road where there is little chance of there being any witnesses. In the last video, I'd mentioned the encounter along a rural stretch of road near Nia Bay. It sounds slightly familiar, but fortunately for the woman, her car was not hit in an attempt to cause it to swerve off the road. The only explanation for Israel doing this is so that he could kidnap someone, or he was trying to torment a lone woman for his own sick pleasure. As the book progresses, the story begins to focus much more on the killer's house, where he is a new captive locked in his basement. The killer had spotted the 16-year-old girl in a newspaper and had murdered her parents and taken her 1 year prior to the present day events. This book just keeps getting darker and darker. By the time that the killer leaks this new information, he's managed to overpower China and has her captive in his home as well. He lets China know that he's bisexual and not all his victims are random. Some of his crimes are very well planned out. Here is a quote from the book. By various means, usually 2 or 3 weeks prior to one of his expeditions, Mr. Vest carefully selects his primary targets, like the Templeton family. And though he sometimes brings back a living prize for the cellar room, he nearly always travels well beyond the borders of Oregon to minimise the chances that his 2 lives, good citizen and homicidal adventurer, will cross at the most inconvenient moment. Though he didn't employ this method to get Laura Templeton, he has found that clandestine browsing via computer through the huge Department of Motor Vehicles records in neighbouring California is an excellent method of locating attractive women. Their driver's license photograph headshots only are now on file with the DMV. Israel had stated that his retirement plans have a dungeon for keeping victims, and it's chilling when you realise that many other serial killers have admitted to desiring the same exact thing. The theme of his victims not being random has cropped up in the case, and it has been said that Israel had been watching Samantha Koenig for some time. Her abduction didn't seem random. His vehicle had been seen in the parking lot opposite the coffee stand weeks prior to her kidnapping. And Lorraine Currier had mentioned that someone had been stalking her prior to her murder, including an unknown person standing outside her house at night. Now, I'm not saying that Israel had specific victims picked prior to leaving on a trip, but in Samantha's case, it's very possible. Again, the basement dungeon and planned out kidnapping themes are major in this book. We also know that Israel was bisexual, targeting both male and female victims. Like the killer, a victim's gender seemed irrelevant to him. The killer makes the comment that it's about the sensation. The book was published in 1995. As the new millennium approaches, the killer fantasises about the past. He thinks about Jack the Ripper and other serial killers who don't have to deal with the prospect of future technology. Israel mentioned being more interested with turn-of-the-century serial killers, a new phenomenon at the time. Israel also used the same phrase as the killer in Intensity. When asked why he killed his parents by pouring firelighter fluid in their bed and then setting them on fire, the killer responds by saying, "Why not?" The book Intensity is very graphic, as it goes from one perspective to the other. By writing a good chunk of the book from the killer's perspective, the audience can see what he has planned and learn about his past history of causing damage to other people. Israel mirrored the killer in a lot of ways, and I feel like he was influenced by some of the events from this book. It is similar in many ways to Kuntz's other book, Mr. Murder, and I'd recommend checking that video out. I feel like it was a starting point for Israel in terms of him being influenced into potential new criminal ideas, methods of avoiding detection, or finding similar traits that which both him and the killer shared. The killer leads 2 separate lives and can hide his dark side. Israel managed to do the exact same thing for 14 years. This has been the video on the Dean Koontz book Intensity and how it could have influenced Israel Keyes and his crimes. As always, thank you for watching.